Hey, check it out, I've got a new look. Special thank you to MindSpatch for creating these avatars for me. Go give them a follow on YouTube and social media to see more cool artwork. And this video is sponsored by me. My art store is now live. The link's in the description where you can purchase canvas prints, foam-mounted prints, and high-quality paper prints of all of the art seen on my channel in 2 different sizes. But you being here is good enough for me, so thank you. Now, on to the video. In an interview from February 2022 with Edge magazine, Hidetaka Miyazaki was asked the question, "Why does the concept of a tree have such a grip on your imagination?" Regarding the Erdtree, he proceeds to give a lengthy response and within says, "This tree with golden glowing leaves is something that fits my ideal for something that represents the world physically. It's something that burns that image into your mind, but it also stands as something that represents the rules and an order of the world. What can represent these rules and order, but also not be absolute? That was the question that ran through my mind when I created this image, and the tree fits the bill nicely for that, because a tree is something that's alive. It's something that grew. It's something that will eventually wither and die. The Erdtree was never meant to live forever, and the Golden Order was meant to wither alongside it. The destined death of this order implies the existence of orders that preceded it. In the previous entry of my series on the divine trees of Elden Ring, I discussed my theories surrounding the primordial form of the Erdtree, the Crucible. I stated that before being brought to the lands between by the greater will, its power was held within the sun, and I stated that the power of the Crucible is one of the manifestations of the Elden Ring. Yet I did acknowledge a key item description that could be understood as contradictory, that being a description I've referenced a few times throughout the series, Siluria's tree. It states that the primordial matter that became the Erdtree was close in nature to life itself, and that the spear is modeled on its crucible, which is obviously implied to be a tree. So if the primordial form of the Erdtree was also the shape of a tree, but the crucible was originally in the sun, there must be another divine tree to bridge the gap, right? Enter one of the most controversial topics in Elden Ring lore, the Greattree. So let's first address the controversy in even stating that a Greattree existed. It's a topic that's been discussed by many other people, but I'll run through it in case you are unaware of the debate. In the English localization of the game, it's stated very clearly to exist in the root resin item description, which states, "The roots of the Greattree were once linked to those of the Erdtree, or so they say." And it's for this reason catacombs are built around Greattree roots. There is also the map of the deep root depths, which says that the roots of the Erdtree are the source of the Shifra and Ainsel rivers, and that here too begins the network of great tree roots that spread throughout the lands between. And finally, we have the description of Deathroot, which talks briefly about the Knight of Black Knives and that the rune of death spread across the lands between through the underground roots of the Greattree, sprouting in the form of Deathroot. So taking the English localization at face value, it seems like an open and shut case. There was a tree that was named the Greattree, and at one point the roots of the Greattree and the Erdtree were connected. But when we consider the Japanese version of the game, it's not at all definitive. Instead of roots of the Greattree, we have this, which according to my sources can be translated as great tree roots, providing a description of tree roots that are of enormous size, but not necessarily denoting a singular great tree. But I'm not fluent in Japanese. I actually don't speak Japanese at all, outside a handful of keywords and concepts, so I'm just going to link to a few sources down in the description. But one of the explanations I have seen for this description in the Japanese version is that great tree roots could be understood as referring to the roots of the minor Erdtrees, which makes sense. But I do want to point out that the name Erdtree doesn't exist in the Japanese version either. The Japanese name translates to golden tree, and even the great tree in some item descriptions. So let's just take a field trip to these great tree roots themselves. These straighter golden roots must be that of the Erdtree, but there are also these spiraling roots as well. They are a different shape and color from those of the Erdtree, so these are most certainly the roots of some other tree. These roots extend far beyond those of the Erdtree, far off into the void that surrounds the nameless eternal city and throughout the lands between, intermingling with the roots of minor Erdtrees far and wide. This must be the network of great tree roots that the map description speaks of. But it is worth noting that when we look at the great tree roots, they come in a few colors. Some are reddish brown with golden sparkles, many are blackened due to Godwin's infection, and a few of them are white. We'll return to this later. It might go without saying, but I am firmly in the camp that believes that there was a Greattree that existed before the Erdtree. Now, I am not saying that the Erdtree and the Greattree have no common lineage, quite the opposite, but that the Greattree is the Erdtree's progenitor. After all, the primordial form of the Erdtree is the crucible of life, and the twisting, spiraling roots that we see in the deep root depths heavily invoke this connection. This points to a theme that is extremely prevalent in all From Software titles: cyclical world building and the reincarnation of archetypes. But before we go into that, let's ask ourselves, what was this Greattree like? While we have no other name to go with other than Greattree, we do have other trees that are either implied to have existed or outright stated to exist in the prehistory of the lands between that might be possible candidates. In the game, I can pinpoint at least 4 distinct possibilities that could fit this role: the Spiral Tree, the Hellfen, a tree that I'm going to call the Crucible Tree, and a Greattree that's just distinct on its own. First, I'm going to address the idea that there was a Greattree that has no other names or ties to anything else in the lore. This is entirely possible. In the various texts we discussed earlier, Greattree is a proper noun. There's nothing else to go on, and so maybe this should just be taken at face value. But there certainly were other divine trees, so I want to indulge the idea that one of these other trees could have also been the Greattree. So let's talk about the Hellfen. The Hellfen, despite what some extremely influential lore theorists have concluded, was not the Shadow Keep, but was in fact a tree. The Japanese item description calls it a tree of light, and this is backed up by the English localization poetically calling it lampwood. It exudes an essence called the lamplight, which is similar to grace in appearance, and it guides the dead of the spirit world, which okay, now there's a spirit world? Jeez. But only those who met their death in battle can see the lamplight. The parallels to the Erdtree should be pretty clear. We have a luminous tree that guides the dead, but not just anyone, only those that it sees as being valiant or worthy of its grace. It's true that the Shadowkeep has ties to the Hellfen, given the fact that the battlements of the Shadowkeep are nearly identical to the Hellfen steeple design, which is modeled after the tree. And there is the presence of the Tibia Mariner boats within the keep that are tied to the Ghost Flame cult, which lived in the age before the Erdtree. So when looking for contenders to fill the role of the Greattree, the Hellfen checks many of the boxes. But I'm hung up on one detail, and that's the fact that the description is present tense. It guides the dead of the spirit world. The lamplight is similar to grace in appearance. These phrases are pretty explicitly saying that the Hellfen still exists somewhere in the spirit world, I guess. The Hellfen, the age of the ghost flame, the spirit world, all of these are quite the rabbit hole that I don't have time for right now. I'm not sure if I'll do a video on it, but if that's interesting to you, let me know in the comments. But suffice to say, the fact that the Hellfen is implied to still currently exist at the time of the base game disqualifies it from being the primordial form of the Erdtree. Unless you want to say that the Hellfen is the Erdtree, but that's a whole other discussion. So now let's talk about the spiral tree, most explicitly depicted on the spiral tree seal. It depicts a white tree with two helical trunks and two more straight trunks that form hands at the top. There is a great video by Scum Mage Infa called The Divine Tower Trees, The True Purpose of the Divine Towers, where they examine the Divine Tower tree from Night Rain and make various connections to the base game. It's linked below if you want to watch it later, but the crux of the video is their theory that the two fingers acted like seeds which grew into the Divine Tower trees in order to form an array that fostered connection to the greater will. And regarding that premise, it's kinda hard to argue against it. The Divine Tower tree from Night Rain is the closest thing that we can see that resembles the design on the spiral tree seal. And it's also the closest thing that we can see to the tablets found in Belgorod that depict a spiral tree, as well as maybe even the cross tree tower shield. It's worthy to note that the trees depicted on the tower shield and the Belgorod tablets do not feature hands, so there could be another spiral tree that once existed, one that's not grown from the two fingers, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is the case. We have the handsy Divine Tower trees and a more natural ancient spiral tree. Because if every spiral tree was composed of two gigantic hands, surely this essential imagery would have been recorded in every depiction. But putting all these clues together, I think that we can say for certain that a spiral tree, or rather several spiral trees, existed in the time before the Erdtree. I think the concept is a probable contender for the Greattree, especially if we favor the Japanese description of Greattree roots rather than a singular Greattree. It really checks all the boxes. Well, except for one. Siluria's tree. MVP item description for this series implies that it was modeled after the Greattree, or at least some form of primordial tree, which looks nothing like the spiral tree but is still claimed to be the primordial matter that became the Erdtree. So let's move on to the crucible tree, as I call it. Siluria's tree's description is basically all the written evidence that we have that this maybe even existed, but it's not the only environmental evidence. Let's return to where it all began, the foot of the Erdtree, and examine the giant stone seal that once protected the Erdtree's inner sanctum. Few mysteries in the game have intrigued me quite like the stonework that's embedded in the Erdtree. I believe the stone relief to be a seal that was placed over a crack in the Erdtree stump, a seal which is now broken. From my interpretation, this is detailing the history of the Erdtree, and I read it from top to bottom. And to clarify, we are entering the speculation zone here. I could spend a whole video talking about the entire thing, let me know if you want that. But for now, I'm just going to give a brief overview. So right at the top, we have what looks like a tree with pointed crucible-like horn branches. Right off the bat, I'm going to state that I believe that this is a depiction of the crucible tree we just discussed. It's the only other thing that I've found in game that closely resembles Siluria's tree. And compared to depictions of the Erdtree seen below it, this crucible tree must have been massive in scale, even more grandiose than the already gigantic Erdtree, large enough for the roots to permeate the entire lands between, perhaps. Though, I am not claiming that these carvings are exactly to scale, and I recognize that they may be more symbolic. It might also be safe to assume that the color of this tree would have been reddish gold. There seem to be appendages that resemble pea pods budding off of the branches, and this brings two things to mind. One is the relief that you see all over Farum Azula and associated ruins. This is showing a stylized tree emerging from a pot, or a crucible, with beasts budding off of its branches. In the arch above this beast tree, we have a similar plant motif that can be found in several variations across ancient cultures of the lands between, and in this depiction, we see pea pod-like structures. The second thing that comes to mind are the stone doors found within the catacombs and even on the Elden throne itself, which depict people emerging from the branches of a divine tree, very likely the Erdtree. So, we have a primitive tree, budding animals being depicted in the most ancient of civilizations, and then an evolved tree, budding people in a much more modern society. There's crazy stuff here, which implies that life literally emerged from the original divine tree, and that this cycle continued throughout basically the modern day. But these, of course, could be symbolic depictions. Continuing down the Erdtree stone seal, we see this crucible tree becomes a smaller tree that eventually grows into the Erdtree, and running down the center of all of these trees is a giant spike, or perhaps a tower. If the divine towers were braces for the hypothetical divine tower trees, then it would make sense to assume that the Erdtree is also formed around a divine tower. The hollow within the Erdtree sanctum and the ornate architecture leading up to the Door of Light definitely support this. However, the ornamentation here is subtly different from that of the Divine Towers and reminiscent of the patterns that are found all over the Elden Throne area. Also, the Erdtree is much larger than the Divine Towers, so a brace of proportionate size would need to be constructed. I'm not going to make a definitive statement that the Erdtree was or was not grown around a divine tower, and the spike seen in this giant stone relief could just be showing that the Elden Ring's power flows through all of this. So let me know if you think that there's a divine tower hidden within the Erdtree somewhere. But anyways, this crucible tree, in my opinion, is the best candidate for the Greattree. In the Erdtree stone seal, we see a direct lineage between the Greattree and the Erdtree, just as hypothesized. So what about the ancient spiral tree I alluded to, or the Handsy divine tower trees? How does this connect with the most ancient form of the crucible, the sun? Well, I think I've laid enough groundwork. It's finally time to strap on your tinfoil hats if you haven't already, take a swig of your preferred beverage, inhale your favorite legal mixture of air particles, and join me as I relay my theory about the history of the lands between, the crucible, the Greattree, and of course, the sun. Disclaimer: much of my interpretation has been derived from referencing real-world mythology such as Norse mythology, combined with the conclusions already drawn in my own videos, as well as the work of others, so your interpretation may vary quite a bit. And before we begin, remember Miyazaki's quote from the beginning of the video regarding why he chose a tree to represent the world's order. Quote, "What can represent these rules and order but also not be absolute? The tree fits the bill nicely for that because a tree is something that's alive, it's something that grew, it's something that will eventually wither and die." So I believe in the very beginning, what I'll call the first age, there was the sun and the planet that serves as our setting. Kinda crazy that we don't have a name for this planet, to be honest. The first beings to walk the land were the primordial giants, or the titans, as most people refer to them as, along with megafauna versions of common animals. And I'm drawing from Norse mythology for that. Bathed in the rays of the sun, the aspects of the crucible would grow on their bodies. To implement order into life on this planet, the Greater Will created the first divine tree, which was the ancient spiral tree. This was the source of the white spiral roots seen underground, and it was depicted on the cross tree tower shield and the Hornsent tablets. And for this, I'm drawing upon Miyazaki's known inspiration from the series Berserk and its world tree depicted in that series. But this ancient spiral tree gathered the holy essence of the crucible that was emitted by the sun and filtered it to allow more orderly life forms to develop. Beasts diversified, and the ecosystem was established when Metyr, Mother of Fingers, would arrive. She would grant a select few of the beasts with intelligence, and the first civilizations began to form. These would include Farum Azula and later Rau, though it's possible that these are just the only ones we have evidence for. And it is worthy to note that Metyr and the Fingers had a great deal of influence on the ancient dragons, since many of them wore crowns of fingers on their heads. After an incredibly long time, the ancient spiral tree, being a living organism itself, would die, leaving the sun to power the established development of the world. This would be the advent of the Sun Realm and the Second Age. We know that this was an extremely vast expanse of time, since there are both beastmen, who I believe are the ancestors of humans, and humans themselves who live in death, and they all bear the Sun Realm shield. The Titans would continue to evolve into lesser giants, and then eventually the fire giants. And in the absence of a divine tree, some people look to the stars for guidance, becoming the first astrologers. According to Nameless Singer's excellent video, these two groups would form an alliance of Night and Flame, and the civilization of Ra'u would be founded. And I theorize that it was around this time that the new moon would also arrive in the lands between and join this society. Ra'u would spread their culture and holistic spiritual practices across the lands between. The divine towers, the forge of the giants, and the ancient art of smithing would be created. Eventually, the worship of the greater will and the fingers would become limited to Farum Azula, giving way to a polytheistic religion that worshipped the outer gods, who at this time were not wholly malevolent entities, and as I shared in part 2, derived from the Crucible. The Ghost Flame cult would gain particular prominence, and their death rites would become standard across the world. I also think that this is when the Greater Will cut off contact with Metyr, due to her no longer having a hand in shaping how civilization would develop. Now, this is extremely speculative, but I think that in an attempt to vie for power, Metyr manipulated Ra'u into using the Divine Towers as braces for her own creations, the Divine Tower Trees. They would be grown from her fingered children in an attempt to re-establish her link to the Greater Will, and the Divine Tower Tree we see in Night Rain was a recreation of one of these. But the Greater Will had other plans. It would send the power of the sun to the lands between, along with its vassal, the Elden Beast, to begin a new age. As a result, what remained of the sun would become lifeless and frigid. The Ra'u civilization was decimated and only small pockets survived, including the Newman, who would eventually diversify into the Shaman and the Nox, along with other survivors that would eventually become the Hornsent. A new divine tree would emerge from the ashes, within lying the Elden Beast and the essence that would form into the Elden Ring. This is the birth of the Greattree, and it is the source of the brown spiral roots found in the deep root depths. The primordial matter that would eventually become the Erdtree was now firmly rooted in the lands between. This would mark the end of the Sun Realm and the beginning of the Third Age, the Age of the Greattree. This would be the age of the first Elden Lords and the first avatars of the Greater Will who would harness the Elden Ring to command their authority. We know that the first Elden Lord was probably Placidusax, and likely a maiden from Farum Azula was chosen to be the god. I speculate that this was because they remained loyal to the Greater Will in the Fingers, whilst the people of Ra'u turned to their own pagan polytheistic beliefs. We don't know how long they reigned, but we do know that eventually the god of Placidusax disappeared, and with the fall of Farum Azula, Metyr and the Fingers would lose their grasp on society once again. During this age, people who practiced ghost flame death rites outside the lands between arrived on their stone coffin ships, and it's likely that their patriarch, the famous Elden John, became the god after the previous one vanished. The ancient dynasty would be established. Elden John would abandon the old practices of his culture, evidenced by the putrescence accumulating in the stone coffin ships we find in the DLC, and this might also be indicated by the statues of Elden John casting down the Imago Mundi and embracing the relief of a tree. See Tarnished Archaeologist's video on the subject, linked in the description. With this, tree worship would be restored as the dominant religion throughout the lands between. The ancient dynasty still seemed to be somewhat holistic and polytheistic, since we can find servants of Rot and servants of Moog worshipping his statues, but at the center of it all was the worship of the Greattree. We don't know how long this age lasted. There isn't much else to speculate on other than some statues of Elden John that seem to show him merging with or becoming a tree, so it can be assumed that he disappeared as well, and with him the ancient dynasty fell into decline. The Great Tree itself would eventually die, heralding the Fourth Age, the second that's marked with the absence of a divine tree, and possibly the first since the Golden Star's arrival to be without a god. It was in this age that the Hornsent would rise to prominence. Studying the ruins of civilizations prior, the Hornsent would develop an aesthetic belief system surrounding the spirituality of horns and the crucible. We kinda know the rest. They would construct their own tower to reach divinity, much like their Rauan ancestors. They would enslave a population of surviving Newmen who were known as the shamans and use their unique physical properties in alchemical rituals designed to create a candidate for ascendancy. I also theorize that they wanted their hypothetical god to resurrect the ancient spiral tree because we have their stone tablets depicting the ancient spiral tree as well as many sickly, failed attempts at growing one all over their territory. The rest, while still ambiguous, is much more familiar. The Mother of Fingers, long forgotten but always lurking in the shadows, would emerge again to grasp for power. Seducing a young shaman who is made vulnerable through persecution and savagery at the behest of the Hornsent, she would guide her puppet through the Hornsent rituals to claim candidacy. But in reality, Metyr was the puppet, for this shaman woman was shrewd and cunning. Once she assumed the mantle of the Greater Will's avatar, she would not carry out the Hornsent's wishes, and she would eventually betray the Mother of Fingers, sealing her away to be slain by her hero at a later time. She would harness the Elden Ring to create an order that she desired, the Golden Order, and thus began the Fifth Age of the Lands Between, the Age of the Erdtree. So, TLDR. In the beginning, there was the sun, the crucible, and the ancient spiral tree, and from the tree emerged the first animals. Metyr arrived, kickstarted society by granting some beast with intelligence. After the spiral tree dies, as it naturally does, this left the lands between without a connection to the greater will. Rau arose and formed their own polytheistic religion that did not directly worship the greater will or the fingers. Metyr convinced Rau to use their divine towers as a seedbed to plant two fingers who were to act as seeds which would grow into the Handsy divine tower trees seen in Night Rain. The greater will didn't like what Metyr was doing and decided to send the power of the sun to the lands between, leaving what remained in the sky lifeless and frigid. And the sun became the Greattree, the primordial matter of life rooted in the lands between. The first Elden Lord and Elden God emerged, but this god eventually disappeared. Elden John arrived in the lands between and began worshipping the Greattree, cementing tree worship into the zeitgeist and forgetting about Metyr. Eventually, the Greattree died, and once again the lands between was left without a divine tree. The Hornsent built a tower to reach the gods, a la the Tower of Babel, just like the Rauans, and Metyr manipulated a particular shaman woman into climbing the ranks to use the tower to become a god. She did, and her name was Marika, and the Erdtree was born, establishing the greater will and the fingers' dominance once again. And once again, the people who built the tower and the Mother of Fingers were betrayed by the greater will when Marika sealed them away in the land of shadow and had them killed. It is merely a cycle. Stand before the Elden Ring. Become the Elden Lord. This is the item description for the very first item that we receive in the game, Memory of Grace. It is easy to try and connect the scattered pieces of ancient lore to names, characters, and places that are much more familiar to us, like maybe the maiden with 3 wolves in Farum Azula was Marika, or maybe Placidusax was the Stormlord that Godfrey defeated, maybe everyone and everything was a mimic, and maybe all of these are true. That's kind of the fun of unraveling the lore of a fantasy world. It's low stakes, and there are no facts other than what can be taken from the game. But I think it's easy to forget the vast expanses of time in between these events, and that some things are simply lost to history. Of course, the presence of immortal beings muddy the water a bit, But I think that's the kind of fictional history that Miyazaki and George R.R. Martin were going for when crafting the world building of Elden Ring. One that is vast, with only a few clues to play with, like Hakoniwa, but with storytelling. But one thing that is prevalent in all of the games directed by Miyazaki is that the events of these games play out in cycles, loops, or as Alan Wake would put it, spirals. And that's what I enjoy most about my theory of the divine trees. We have a cycle of the divine tree being created. The Mother of Fingers exerts her influence. The tree dies, and Metyr loses the influence. Civilization then attempts to reach the divine on their own, and Metyr attempts to regain control, and all of this results in the birth of a new divine tree. And there's plenty of room for other events to have occurred. I didn't talk at all about the Godskins or the Serpent Cult. I barely touched on the Nox, just to name a few topics. There could have even been other Elden gods or divine trees that we know nothing about, or maybe you arranged the events of the ancient past of the Lands Between in a different way, and that's okay. But this is my interpretation of the prehistory of the Lands Between and the through line that connects all of my previous lore theories. Even if you have a different take on the esoteric origins of everything in this universe, or you're a Greattree denier, I hope that you enjoyed the ride and I gave you some interesting alternate takes. And that is where I will end it. So if you stuck around for all 3 parts of my Divine Tree series, I want to say thank you so much for indulging me and showing your interest. I have several videos in the works, and I want to cover some other things that are not Elden Ring, but this damn game just keeps pulling me in, so don't be surprised when more Elden Ring content's on the way. Other scripts that you might see are about Metroid, Signalis, and Nine Souls, so like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you want to hear more from me later on. If you'd like to support my channel, you can buy my art, link below, or you can join as a member. You'll get exclusive perks such as early access to videos, a link to my Miro board, and a signature shoutout at the end of the video. Until next time, may the light of grace guide you through these dark times. Take action against tyranny in any way you can. And to my American audience, if it's possible, prepare to defend yourself because things have only just begun.